Good evening. This is Knowledge Time. Welcome, alchemists. Today I'll be reading from the book The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. Currently, I am in chapter 14. Resist the downward pull of the group, the law of conformity. We have a side to our character that we are generally unaware of. Our social personality, the different person we become when we operate in groups of people. In the group setting, we unconsciously imitate what others are saying and doing. We think differently, more concerned with fitting in and believing what others believe. We feel different emotions. Infected by the group mood, we are more prone to taking risks, to acting irrationally because everyone else is. This social personality can come to dominate who we are, listening so much to others and conforming our behavior to them. We slowly lose a sense of our uniqueness and the ability to think for ourselves. The only solution is to develop self awareness and a superior understanding of the changes that occur in us in groups. With such intelligence, we can become superior social actors, able to outwardly fit in and cooperate with others on a high level, while retaining our independence and rationality. Part 1. An experiment in human nature. As a young boy growing up in communist China, Giao Jinghao, born 1952, dreamed of becoming a great writer. He loved literature, and his teachers commended him for his essays and poems. In 1964, he gained admittance to the Yinhen Middle School, YMS, not far from where his family lived, located in the town of Yizhen, several hundred miles north of Beijing. YMS was labeled a key school. Over 90% of its students went on to college. It was difficult to get into and quite prestigious. At YMS, Wan Hu was a quiet and studious boy. He had ambitions of graduating in 6 years with a top record, good enough to get into Beijing University, from where he would launch the writing career he dreamed about. Students at YMS lived on campus, and life there could be rather dull since the Communist Party regulated almost every aspect of life in China, including education. There were daily military drills, propaganda classes, manual labor duty, and regular classes, which could be rigorous. At YMS, Wan developed a close friendship with a classmate named Fang Pu, perhaps the most zealous communist at school. Pale and thin and wearing glasses, Fang Pu looked the type of the intellectual revolutionary. He was 4 years older than Jing Hu, but they had bonded over their common love of literature and their desire to become writers. They had their differences. Fang Pu's poetry centered on political issues. He worshipped Chairman Mao Zedong and wanted to emulate not only his writings, but also his revolutionary career. Jing Hao, on the other hand, had little interest in politics, even though his father was a respected Communist War veteran and government official. But they joined their literary discussions, and Fang Pu treated Jing Hao like a young brother. In May of 1966, as Jing Hao was engrossed in his studies, preparing for the final exams to end his second year, Fang Pu paid him a visit, and he seemed unusually animated. He had been scouring the Beijing newspapers to keep up with trends in the capital, and recently he had read of a literary debate started by several renowned intellectuals that he had to share with Jing Hao. These intellectuals had accused well-known respected writers of hiding counter-revolutionary messages in their plays, films, and magazine articles. They based these accusations on careful readings of certain passages in the writer's work that could be seen as veiled criticisms of Mao himself. Certain people are using art and literature to attack the party and socialism, said Fang Pu. This debate is about the future of the revolution, he said, and Mao must be behind it all. To Jin Hao, it all seemed a bit tedious and academic, but he trusted his older friend's instincts, and he promised to follow the events in the newspaper. Feng Pu's words proved prophetic. Within a week, papers throughout China had picked up the story of the raging debate. Teachers at YMS began to talk about some of the newspaper articles in their classes. One day, the school's Communist Party secretary, a paunchy man named Ding Wei, called for an assembly and gave a speech recounting almost verbatim an editorial against the counter-revolutionary writers. Something was definitely in the air. The students now had to devote so many hours every day to discussing the latest turns in the debate. Throughout Beijing, posters with large headlines had appeared everywhere, attacking the anti-party black line, meaning those who were secretly trying to put the brakes on the communist revolution. Ding supplied the students with materials for making their own posters, and the students happily threw themselves into the task. They largely copied the posters from Beijing. Jin Han's friend Zhong Wei, a talented artist, made the most attractive posters of all. With his elegant calligraphy, within days, almost all of the walls of the school were covered with posters. The secretary Ding roamed around the campus reading them, smiling, and approving of the work. To Jing Han, it was all quite novel and exciting, and he loved the new look of the campus walls. The campaign in Beijing focused on local intellectuals everyone knew, but in Yinghan, this seemed rather distant. If China was being infiltrated by all kinds of counter-revolutionaries, that meant that they had also probably infiltrated the school itself, and the only logical place for the students to look for such class enemies was among their teachers and school officials. They began to scrutinize their lectures and lessons for hidden messages, much as the intellectuals had done with the work of famous writers. The geography teacher Lu always talked about the beautiful landscapes of China, but hardly ever mentioned the inspiring words of Mao. Could that mean something? The physics teacher Feng had an American father who had served in the U.S. Navy. Was he secretly an imperialist? Li, the teacher of China, had fought initially on the side of the nationalists against the communists during the revolution, but in the last year had switched sides. The students had always trusted his version of events, and he was Jing Hao's favorite teacher because he had such a flair for telling stories. But in retrospect, he seemed a bit old-fashioned and Borgias. Could he still be a counter-revolutionary nationalist at heart? Soon a few posters appeared that questioned the fervor of some of these teachers. Secretary Dean found this a trivial application of the debate, and he ordered a ban on all posters attacking teachers. By June, the movement sweeping Beijing and soon all of China had acquired a name: the Great Socialist Cultural Revolution. It was indeed Mao himself who had instigated it all by setting up the newspaper articles, and he was to be the ongoing leader of the new movement. He feared that China had been slipping back into its feudal past. Old ways of thinking and acting had returned. Bureaucracies had become breeding grounds for a new type of elite. Peasants remained relatively powerless. He wanted a wake-up call to revive the revolutionary spirit. He wanted the younger generation to experience revolution firsthand by making it themselves. He proclaimed to young people that it was right to rebel, but the word he used in Chinese for this was Xiaofang, which literally means to turn everything upside down. It was young people's duty, he said, to question authority. Those who secretly worked to pull China back into its past he called revisionists, and he implored students to help him uncover the revisionists and root them out of the new revolutionary China. Taking these pronouncements of Mao as a call to action, Feng Pu created the most audacious poster anyone had yet seen. It was a direct attack on Secretary Ding himself. Deng was not only the school's party secretary but also a veteran of the revolution and a highly respected figure. According to Fang Pao, however, his prohibition on criticizing teachers proved he was a revisionist, bent on suppressing the questioning spirit Mao had encountered. This created quite a stir. The students had been reared to unquestionably obey those in authority, particularly respected party members. Fang Pu had broken this taboo had he gone too far. A few days after the appearance of Fang Pu's poster, some strangers arrived on campus from Beijing. They were part of work teams sent to schools around China to help supervise and maintain some discipline over the Borgian Cultural Revolution. The work team at YMS ordered Feng Pu to publicly apologize to Secretary Ding. At the same time, however, they lifted the ban on posters that criticized teachers, as in schools around China. They also suspended all classes and exams at YMS. Students were to devote themselves to making revolution under their watchful eye. Suddenly, feeling free of the yoke of the past and all the habits of obedience drummed into them, the students at YMS began to brazenly attack those teachers who had demonstrated less than revolutionary zeal or had been unkind to students. Jing Hao felt compelled to join the campaign, but this was difficult. He happened to like almost all of his teachers. He did not want to seem, however, like a revisionist. Besides, he respected the wisdom and authority of Mao. He decided to make a poster attacking teacher Wen, who had criticized him once for not being sufficiently interested in politics, which had bothered him at the time. He made his criticisms of her as gentle as possible. Others took this up and went further with their attacks on teacher Ying, and Jing Hao felt bad. To satisfy the students' growing anger, some teachers began to confess to some minor revolutionary sins, but this made the students feel they were hiding even more. They had to apply more pressure to get them to reveal the truth, and a student nickname, Little Bawang. Bawang meaning overseer, referring to the love of giving orders, had an idea on how to do this. He had read Mao's description of how during the revolution in the 1940s, peasants had captured the most notorious landlords and paraded them through their villages with enormous dunce caps on their heads and heavy wooden boards with inscription describing their crimes hung around their necks. To avoid such public humiliation, certainly the teachers would come clean and confess. The students agreed to try this, and their first target for such treatment was to be teacher Li, Jing Hu's favorite. Teacher Li was accused of faking his switch to communism. Stories began to come out of his telling other teachers about his visit to brothels in Shanghai. Clearly he had a secret life, and Jing Hao now felt disappointed in Li. China, before the Communist Revolution, had been a cruel place, and if Li was working to bring that back, he could only hate him. Unwilling to confess to any crime, Li was the first to be paraded through school with the dunce cap and board around his neck. Along the way, some students poured a bucket of poster paste over his head. Jing Hao followed the parade from a distance, trying to repress his uneasiness at the humiliation of his teacher. Led by little Ba Wang, the students imposed the same fate on more teachers, the dunce cap becoming unbearably tall and the boards heavier. Imitating their revolutionary brothers and sisters in Beijing, the students initiated struggle meetings, in which they forced certain teachers into the jet plane position, a student standing on either side, pushing teachers to their knees, pulling their hair back with a jerk, then holding their arms out and back, like the wings of a jet plane. It was a most painful position, but it seemed to work, as after an hour or two of this, with students jeering at them, many teachers began to confess. The students were right in their suspicions. The school had been teeming with revisionists right under their noses. Soon the students' attention turned to the vice principal, Ling Xin, who they discovered was the son of a notorious landlord. He was the third highest official at school, which made this bit of news all the more salacious. Jing Hao had been sent to his office once for misbehavior, and Shang had been quite lenient with him, which he had appreciated at the time. The students locked Lin Xing in a room, where he was to stay between the struggle meetings. But one morning, Jing Ha, serving as the guard on duty, opened the room to discover the vice principal had hung himself. Once again, Jing Ha struggled to repress his discomfort, but he had to admit the suicide made it seem as if Lin Xing was indeed guilty of something. One day, in the midst of all this, Jing Hao ran into Fang Pu, who was bursting with excitement. Since his forced public apology over his poster attacking Ding, he had been laying low. He had spent this time devouring the writings of Mao and Marx and plotting his next move. Word had come from Beijing that the team works were to be withdrawn from all schools. Students were to form their own committee, choose a school official to be its head, and run the school itself through the committee. Fang Pu planned on becoming the student leader of the committee, and he was going to wage open revolution against Secretary Ding. Jing Hao could only admire his bravery and persistence. Through little Ba Wang, who had forced more and more confessions from teachers, Fang Pu learned the Secretary Ding had affairs with at least two female teachers, revealing his audacious hypocrisy. He was the one continually ranting against Western decadence and was always admonishing the male and female students at Ying Hen to keep their distance from each other. Ba Wang and Fang Pu ransacked his office and found that he had been hoarding food coupons and possessed a fancy radio and bottles of nice wine, all hidden away. And now posters attacking Ding filled the walls. Even Jing Han felt indignant at his behavior. Soon, Ding Hua Yi was paraded through school and then through the town of Yizhen. On the head, the most enormous dunce cap, decorated with drawings of monsters, and a very heavy drum hung around his neck as he drummed with one hand while holding the cap with the other. He had to chant, "I am Ding Yi, ox demon and snake spirit." Citizens of Yizhen who knew Secretary Ding gaped at the spectacle. The world had indeed been turned upside down. By the middle of the summer, most of the teachers had fled. When it came time to form the committee to run the school, only a few remained to serve as chairman of the committee, and with Fang Pu as the student leader, a little-known and rather harmless teacher named Ding Xing was named chairman. Now the work team left YMS, and Ding and the committee were in charge. And as the students progressed in making revolution, Jing Hao began to feel increasingly excited. He and his friend Zhong Wei carried old spears and swords as they patrolled the school looking for spies, and it was just like in the novels he loved to read. He and the other students marched in columns into town, waving enormous red flags, carrying large posters of Chairman Mao and copies of his little red book, chanting slogans, banging on drums and crashing cymbals. It was so dramatic, and it felt like they were indeed participating in revolution. One day, they marched through Yizhen, tearing down store and street signs that were vestiges of pre-revolutionary China. Mao would be proud of them. In Beijing, some students had formed groups to support and defend Mao in his Cultural Revolution. They called themselves Red Guards, and their members wore bright red armbands. Mao gave his personal approval to this, and now Red Guard units began to appear in schools and universities around the country. Only the purest and most fervent revolutionaries could be admitted to the Red Guards. A competition was fierce to join their ranks. Because of his father's illustrious past, Jing Hao became a member of the Red Guards, and now he basked in the admiring glances of fellow students and local citizens who noticed the bright red armband that never left him. There was one wrinkle, however, in these exciting events. On a visit home to see his family in the nearby town of Lingxing, Jing Hao discovered that local students had accused his father of being a revisionist. He cared more about farming and economics than about making revolution, said the students. They had gotten him dismissed from his government position. He had to suffer through various struggle meetings in the jet plane position. The family was in disgrace. Although he loved and admired his father and worried for him, he could not help but feel anxious that if news of this disgrace reached his school, he might lose his red armband and be ostracized. He would have to be careful when talking about his family. When he returned to school several weeks later, he noticed some radical changes that had already occurred. Fang Pu had consolidated power. He had formed a group called the East is Red Corps. He and his team had kicked out Chairman Ding and were now running the school themselves. They had started their own newspaper called Battlefield News to promote and defend their actions. Jing Hao also learned that another teacher had died under suspicious circumstances. One day, Fang Pu visited Jing Hao and invited him to be a star reporter for Battlefield News. Fang Pu looked different. He had put on weight, was not so pale, and was trying to grow a beard. It was a tempting offer from his friend, though he tried to disguise his annoyance with a forced smile. Fang Pu was beginning to frighten Jing Hao. Students were now joining the East is Red Corps in mass. But within a few weeks, a rival group calling themselves the Red Rebels emerged on campus. Their leader was Meng Zi, a student whose parents were peasants and who advocated revolution that was more tolerant, based on reason and not violence, which he felt was the pure form of Maoism. He gained some adherents, including Jing Hao's older brother, Wei Hu, who was a student at YMS. Ming Zing's growing popularity infuriated Fang Pu. He called him a royalist, a sentimentalist, and secretary counter-revolutionary. He and his followers destroyed the Red Rebels' office and threatened to do worse. It would certainly cause a complete rift with Fang Pu, but Jing Hao contemplated joining the Red Rebels. He was attracted to their idealism. Just as the tension between the two sides were escalating through outright war, a representative from the Chinese military arrived on campus and announced that the army was now in charge. Mao had dispatched army units throughout the country to take control of schools. The increasing chaos and violence that was engulfing YMS was going on all over China, not only in schools but in factories and government offices as well. The Cultural Revolution was spinning out of control. Soon 36 soldiers arrived on campus, part of an army unit known as the 901st. They ordered that all factions disband and that classes resume. There would be military drilling and discipline would be reestablished. Too much had changed, however, in the 8 months since this had all begun. The students could not accept such a sudden return to discipline. They sulked and did not turn up at classes. Fang Pu took charge of the campaign to get rid of the soldiers. He put up posters accusing the 901st of being enemies of the Cultural Revolution. One day, he and his followers attacked one of the army officers with a slingshot and wounded him. Just as the students feared reprisals, the 901st unit was suddenly recalled from campus without any explanation. The students were now completely on their own, and it seemed a frightening prospect. They quickly allied themselves with one of the two groups. Some joined the East is Red Corps because it was larger and offered better positions. Others joined the Red Rebels because they hated Fang Pu and Little Bawang. And others thought one group or the other was more revolutionary. Jing Hao joined the Red Rebels, as did his friend Zhong Wei. Each side felt certain it represented the true spirit of the Cultural Revolution, and as they yelled at another and argued, fistfights broke out, and there was nobody to stop them. Soon, students were bringing bats and sticks to the fights, and the injuries mounted. One day, some members of the East is Red Corps captured some Red rebels and held them prisoners. The Red rebels could not find out anything about their fate. In the middle of this tense moment, the Red rebels discovered that one of their members, a female student named Yulin, was actually a spy for the other side. Infuriated by such tactics, they tied Yulin up and began to beat her to find out if there were more spies. Much to the dismay of Jiang Hu, who considered this a betrayal of their ideas, they battered and bruised her, but she revealed nothing. Soon Yulin was exchanged for the prisoners held by the East is Red Corps, but now the antipathy between the two sides had reached a breaking point. A few weeks later, the East is Red Corps suddenly left school in a mass and established their headquarters in a building in town that they seized. Mingzi decided to form a team of guerrilla fighters who would operate in Yizhen at night to keep an eye on the corpse and do some sabotage work. Jin Hao was signed to them as a reporter. It was an exciting job. As they encountered the enemy in town, battles with slingshots erupted. Then the corpse captured one of the rebel guerrillas named He Ping. A few days later, he was discovered in a hospital dead. The corpse had taken him for a ride in a jeep in the desert with a sock in his mouth, and he had suffocated along the way. Now even Menzing had enough and vowed revenge for his horrible deed. Jing Hao could only agree with him. As the skirmishes spread throughout the town, citizens fled and entire buildings were abandoned, and looters scoured them for goods. The Red Rebels were soon on the offensive, working with local craftsmen. They manufactured the highest quality swords and spears. Casualties mounted. Finally, the rebels encircled the corpse stronghold in town and prepared for a final offensive. The corpse fled, leaving behind a small band of student soldiers in the building. The rebels demanded their surrender, and suddenly, from a third-floor window, there was the young student, Yulin, screaming out, "I'd rather die than surrender to you." With the corpse's bright red flag in her hand, she shouted, "Long live Chairman Mao," and jumped. Jing Hao found her lifeless body wrapped up in the flag on the ground. Her devotion to the cause astounded and impressed him. Now in control, the Red Rebels established their headquarters at the school and prepared their defenses for a counteroffensive from the corps. They built a makeshift munition factory on campus. Some students had learned how to make grenades and various powerful explosive devices, and inadvertent explosion killed several of them. But the work went on. Zhong Wei, the artist, had enough. Somehow the noble origins of the Red Rebels had been lost, and he feared the expanding violence. He fled Yizhen for good. Jing Hao lost respect for his friend. How could Zhong Wei forget those who had been injured or died for their cause? To give up now would be to say it was all in vain. He would not be a coward like his friend. Besides, the East's Red Corps was downright evil and was capable of doing anything to take power. They had betrayed the revolution. As life at the school settled down and the Red Rebels built up their defensive, Jun Han visited his family, whom he had not seen for a while. When he finally returned one night to school, however, he could not believe his eyes. His Red Rebel comrades were nowhere in sight. Their flag was no longer flying above the school. Everywhere there were armed soldiers. Finally, he found a few comrades hiding in a school building, and they told him what had happened. Mao was reasserting his authority once and for all. He was picking sides in various local conflicts to help create some order, and the military in the country had come down on the side of the East's Red Corps as the more truly revolutionary group. The repercussions of this could be awful. Jing Hao and several other comrades decided they would try to escape and regroup in the mountains, where Meng's Meng Xing had apparently fled, but there was a blockade throughout the county and they were forced back to school, which had become more of a prison overseen by the East's Red Corps. Now the rebels could only expect the worst. To the corps, they were a bunch of counter-revolutionaries who had beaten and killed their comrades. Then one day, as the Red Rebel members on campus were huddled together in a room, the leaders of the East is Red Corps, including Fang Pu and Little Ba Wang, entered with grenades tied to their belts. Fang Pu carried a blacklist of all those who were to be taken from the room, clearly for some nefarious purpose. Fang Pu appeared friendly toward Jing Hao and told him it was not too late to change sides. But Jing Hao could no longer see Fang Pu in the same light. His friendliness made him seem even more sinister. The night they could hear the screams of their blacklisted comrades from another building. Then news reached them that corps members had found Meng Xing, beaten him up, and marched him back to school, where he was under arrest as well. In the room next to where Jing Hao and his friends now slept, they observed little Ba Wang. And his team covering the windows with blankets. They were transforming it into a torture chamber. Soon they noticed former Red Rebels limping about on campus, afraid to talk to anyone. Then it was Jin Hao's turn to be taken into the room. He was blindfolded and tied to a chair in a most uncomfortable position. They wanted him to sign a withdrawal statement, and as he hesitated to do so, they began to beat him with a chair leg. Jing Hao screamed, "You can't do this to me. We're classmates. We're all class brothers." Little Ba Wang would have none of this. Jing Hao had to confess his crimes, the part he had played in the various battles in town, the names of other Red Rebels hiding somewhere on campus. The blows of his legs became more intense, and then they began to hit him over the head. Still blindfolded, he feared for his life, and in a panic, suddenly spilled the name of a fellow Red Rebel, Dusty. Finally, they carried Jing Hao, unable to walk, out of the room. He quickly felt intense regret that he had named Desu. What a coward he had been. He tried to warn Desu, but it was too late. The torturing of other Red Rebels continued in the room next door, including his brother, Wei Hao, beaten to a bloody pulp. Ming Zi had his head shaved, and when they saw him next, his face was covered in the most hideous bruises. One day, Jing Hao was told his old friend and comrade Zhong Wei had been captured, and when Zhong Hao Wei went to see him, he was unconscious, his bare legs full of large punctures, blood oozing everywhere. They had flailed him with steel hooks for refusing to admit his crimes. How could the rather harmless Zhong Wei inspire such savagery? Wang Hu ran to get the doctor, but when they returned, it was too late. Zhong Wei died in his friend's arm. The dead body was quickly carted away, and a cover story was created for how he had died. Jing Hao was ordered to remain silent. A female teacher who refused to affirm in an affidavit the official East's Red Corps version of his death was beaten and gang raped by little Ba Wang and his followers. In months to come, Fang Pu extended his powers everywhere as he essentially ran the school and classes reassumed. Battlefield News was the only newspaper allowed. The school itself had been renamed East is Red Middle School. With the corps power secure, the torture chamber was dismantled. Classes largely consisted of reciting quotes from Mao. Every morning they assembled before a giant poster of Chairman Mao and brandishing their little red books, chanting to his long life. The East's Red members began a scrumptious rewriting of the past. They held an exhibition to celebrate their victories, full of doctored photographs and fake news reports, all to bolster their side of events. An enormous statue of Chairman Mao, 5 times larger than life, was now installed at the school gate. Towering over everything else, the former members of the Red Rebels had to wear white armbands that described their various crimes. They were made to kowtow before the Mao statue several times a day while classmates kicked them from behind. The former Red Rebels had become like the reviled teachers, cowed and obedient. Jin Hao was forced to do the most menial labor, and having had enough of this in early summer of 1968, he returned to his hometown. His father sent him and his brothers to a farm deep in the mountains where they could be safe and work as laborers. In September, determined to finish his studies, Jiang Hao returned to school. The few months away had given him some perspective, and now when he looked at the East's Red Middle School, it appeared in a very different light. Everywhere he saw signs of unbelievable destruction. Classrooms completely torn up with no desks or chairs. The walls full of peeling posters and crumbling plaster. The science labs devoid of all equipment. Piles of rubble around the campus. Unmarked graves. The music hall blown up by a bomb. And hardly a reputable teacher or official left to resume their education. All of this destruction in a few short years, and for what? What did He Ping and Yuling and Zhou Wing and so many others die for? What had they been fighting over? What had they learned? He could no longer figure it out, and the waste of their young lives filled him with disgust and despair. Soon, Jin Hao and his brothers joined the army to escape the school and buried their memories. Over the following years, as he drove an army truck delivering stone and cement, he and his comrades watched the slow disassembling of the Cultural Revolution, all of its former leaders falling into disgrace. After the death of Mao in 1976, the Communist Party itself finally condemned the Cultural Revolution as a national catastrophe. Interpretation. The above story and characters come from the book Born Red, 1987 by Giao Jung. After the Cultural Revolution, the author changed his name from Giao Jing Hao to Giao Jung. It is his nonfiction account of the events he participated in at his school during the Cultural Revolution. In essence, the Cultural Revolution was Mao's attempt to try to alter human nature itself, according to Mao, through millennia of capitalism in various forms. Humans had become individualistic and conservative, bound to their social class. Mao wanted to wipe the slate clean and start over. As he explained it, a clean slate of paper has no blotches, and so the newest and most beautiful pictures can be painted on it. To get his blank canvas, Mao would have to shake things up on a mass scale by uprooting old habits and ways of thinking and by eradicating people's mindless respect for those in authority. Once he accomplished this, Mao could start to paint something bold and new on the clean sheet. The result would be a fresh generation that could begin to forge a classless society not weighed down by the past. The events depicted in Born Red reveal in a microcosmo the result of Mao's experiment, how human nature cannot be uprooted. Try to alter it, and it merely reemerges in different shapes and forms. The results of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and development cannot be radically re-engineered by some scheme, particularly when it involves the behavior of humans in groups, which inevitably conforms to certain ancient patterns. Although it might be tempting to see what happened at YMS as mostly relevant to group adolescent behavior, young people often represent human nature in a more naked and pure form than adults, who are cleverer at disguising their motivations. In any case, what happened at the school occurred throughout China, in government offices, factories, within the army, and among Chinese of all ages, in an eerily similar way. There's exactly how Mao's experiment failed and what it shows about human nature. Mao had the following specific strategy to enact his bold idea. focus people's attention on a legitimate enemy. In this case, revisionists, those who consciously or unconsciously were clinging to the past. Encourage people, particularly the young, to actively fight against the reactionary force, but also against any entrenched forms of authority. In struggling against these conservative enemies, the Chinese would be able to free themselves from old patterns of thinking and acting. They would finally get rid of elites and ranking systems, and they would unify as a revolutionary class with utmost clarity as to what they were fighting for. His strategy, however, had a fatal flaw at its core. When people operate in groups, they do not engage in nuisance thinking and deep analysis. Only individuals with a degree of calmness and detachment can do this. People in groups feel emotional and excited. Their primary desire is to fit into the group spirit. Their thinking tends to be simplistic, good versus evil, with us or against us. They naturally look for some type of authority to simplify matters for them. Deliberately creating chaos, as Mao did, only makes the group more certain to fall into these primitive patterns of thinking, since it is too frightening for humans to live with too much confusion and uncertainty. Look at how the students at YMS responded to Mao's call for action. When first confronted with the Cultural Revolution, they merely transformed Mao himself into the new authority to guide him. They swallowed his ideas with very little personal reflection. They imitated the actions of others in Beijing in the most conventional way. Looking for revisionists, they tended to base their judgments on appearances, the clothes the teachers wore, the special food or wine they drank, their manners, their family background. Such appearances could be quite deceptive. Teacher Wing was radical in her beliefs but was judged a revisionist based on her fondness for Western style fashion. In the old order, the students were supposed to give total obedience to their all-powerful teachers. Suddenly freed from all that, they remained just as emotionally tied to the past. The teachers still seemed all-powerful, but now as scheming counter-revolutionaries. The students' repressed resentment at having to be so obedient now boiled over into anger and the desire to be the ones doing the punishing and oppressing. When the teachers confessed to crimes they mostly had never committed to avoid the escalating punishments that only seemed to confirm the students in their paranoia, they had shifted roles from obedient students to oppressors. But their thinking had become even more simplistic and irrational, and the opposite of Mao's intention. In the power vacuum that Mao had now created, another timeless group dynamic emerged. Those who were naturally more assertive, aggressive, and even sadistic. In this case, Fang Pu and little Bao Wang pushed their way forward and assumed power, while those who were more passive, Jing Hao, Zhonghui, quietly receded into the background, becoming followers. The aggressive types at YMS now formed a new class of elites, dueling out perks and privileges. Similarly, amid all the confusion the Cultural Revolution had spawned, the students became even more obsessed with status within the group. Who was in the red category among them, and who in the black? They wondered. Was it better now to come from the pleasantry or the proletariat? How could they finagle membership in the Red Guards and garner that beautiful red armband that signified revolutionary elite status? Instead of naturally inclining toward a new egalitarian order, the students kept straining to occupy superior positions. Once all forms of authority were removed and the students ran the school, there was nothing to stop the next and most dangerous development in group dynamics, the split into tribal factions. By nature, we humans reject attempts by anyone to completely monopolize power, as Fang Pu tried to do. This cuts off opportunities for other ambitious, aggressive people. It also creates large groupings in which individual members can feel somewhat lost. Almost automatically, groups will split into rival smaller factions and tribes. In the rival tribe, a new charismatic leader means he, in this case, can assume power and members can identify more easily with a small number of comrades. The bonds are tight and made even tighter by the struggle against the tribal enemy. People may think they are joining because of the different ideas or goals of this tribe or the other, but what they want more than anything is the sense of belonging and a clear tribal identity. Look at the actual differences between the East's Red Corps and the Red Rebels. As the battle between them intensified, it was hard to say what they were fighting for, except to assume power over the other group. One strong or vicious act of one side called for a reprisal from the other, and any type of violence seemed totally justified. There could be no middle ground, nor any questioning of the righteousness of their cause. The tribe is always right, and to say otherwise is to betray it, as Zhong Hui did. Mao had wanted to forge a unified Chinese citizenry, clear as to its goals, and instead the entire country descended into tribal battles completely disconnected from the original purpose of the Cultural Revolution. To make matters worse, the crime rate soared and the economy had ground to a halt. As hardly anyone felt compelled to work or manufacture anything, the masses had become even lazier and more resentful than under the old order. By the spring of 1968, Mao's only recourse was to install a police state. Hundreds of thousands were thrown into prisons. The army virtually took over. To help restore order and respect for authority, Mao converted himself into a cult figure, his image to be worshipped and his words to be repeated like revolutionary prayers. It is interesting to note how Fang Pu's form of repression at YMS, the torture, the rewriting of history, the control of all media, mirrored what Mao was doing throughout the country. The new revolutionary society that Mao and Fang Pu had wanted now actually resembled the most repressive, superstitious regimes of feudal China, as Jing Hao's father, a victim of the Cultural Revolution himself, kept telling his son, a thing turns into its opposite if pushed too far. Understand, we will tend to imagine that this story is an extreme example that has little relevance to our own lives and the groups we belong to. After all, we navigate through worlds full of sophisticated people in high-tech offices where everyone is seemingly so polite and civilized. We see ourselves in a similar way. We have our progressive ideas and our independent thinking. But much of this is an illusion. If we looked at ourselves closely and honestly, we would have to admit that the moment we enter our workspace or any group, we undergo a change. We easily slip into more primitive modes of thinking and behaving without realizing it. Around others, we naturally tend to feel insecure as to what they think of us. We feel pressured to fit in, and to do so, we begin to shape our thoughts and beliefs to the group orthodoxies. We unconsciously imitate others in the group in appearances, verbal expressions, and ideas. We tend to worry a lot about our status and where we rank in the hierarchy. Am I getting as much respect as my colleagues? This is the primate part of our nature. As we share this obsession with status with our chimpanzee relatives, depending on patterns from early childhood in the group setting, we become more passive or more aggressive than usual, revealing the less developed sides of our character. When it comes to leaders, we generally don't see them as ordinary people. We tend to feel somewhat awed and intimidated in their presence, as if they possess some mythical extra powers. When we contemplate our group's main rival or enemy, we can't help but get a little heated and angry and exaggerate any negative qualities. If others in the group are feeling anxious or outraged by something, we often get swept up in the group mood. All of these are subtle indications that we are under the influence of the group. If we are experiencing the above transformations, we can be sure the same is going on with our colleagues. Now imagine some outside threat to our group's well-being or stability, a crisis of sorts. All of the above reactions would be intensified by the stress, and in our apparently civilized, sophisticated group could become quite volatile. We could feel greater pressure to prove our loyalty and go along with anything the group advocated. Our thinking about the rival enemy would become even more simplistic and heated. We we would we would be subject to more powerful waves of viral emotion, including panic or hatred or grandiosity. Our group could split up into factions with tribal dynamics. Charismatic leaders could easily emerge to exploit this volatility. If pushed far enough, the potential for aggression lies under the surface of almost any group. But even if we hold back from overt violence, the primitive dynamic that takes over can have grave consequences. As the group overreacts and makes decisions based on exaggerated fears or uncontrollable excitement. To resist this downward pull that groups inevitably exert on us, we must conduct a very different experiment in human nature from Mao's, with a simple goal in mind: to develop the ability to detach ourselves from the group and create some mental space for true independent thinking. We begin this experiment by accepting the reality of the powerful effect that the group has on us. We are brutally honest with ourselves, aware of how our need to fit in can shape and warp our thinking. Does that anxiety or sense of outrage that we feel come completely from within, or is it inspired by the group? We must observe our tendency to demonetize, demoni- demonize the enemy and control it. We must train ourselves to not blindly venerate our leaders. We respect them for their accomplishments without feeling the need to defy them. We must be especially careful around those who have charismatic appeal and try to demystify and pull them down to earth. With such awareness, we can begin to resist and detach. As part of this experiment, we must not only accept human nature but work with what we have to make it productive. We inevitably feel the need for status and recognition, so let's not deny it. Instead, let's cultivate such status and recognition through our excellent work. We must accept our need to belong to the group and prove our loyalty. But let's do it in a more positive ways, by questioning group decisions that will harm it in the long run, by supplying divergent opinions, by stirring the group in a more rational direction, gently and strategically. Let's use the virtual nature of emotions in the group, but play on different set of emotions by staying calm and patient, by focusing on results and cooperating with others to get practical things done. We can begin to spread this spirit throughout the group, and by slowly mastering the primitive part of our character within the heated environment of the group, we can emerge as individuals who are truly independent and rational. The end point of our experiment. Quote, when people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate each other, by Eric Hoffer. In conclusion, pretty much, wow, I've never even, this is the first time I read about the Red Rebels, so I learned something new, and it opened my eyes to, I mean, I've been like this growing up, pretty much. Once you fall in the mindset of the group, you have to follow the group. You can't grow past the group, and if you do, they'll definitely try to crucify you and either get you back in line, or they'll kick you out. So I've always been the black sheep of my family. I didn't have a father and mother growing up, so I had to figure things out on myself, and I noticed the speed that I think and the way I move is a lot quicker than groups. So, but I like dabbling in groups, finding out what's going on, and then pretty much bouncing to see if if they're growing. But pretty much if they're in groups, they're gonna grow those. It's like an index fund. I'm a global stock investor, so it's like an index fund. So with the index fund, pretty much that's what it feels like. Um, Groups that are a bunch of people in one group, and they'll grow as fast as index funds. Versus, I feel like more I'm individual stock. I just like the volatility, the risk. I can handle the risk and the thrill of it and discovery. I mean, that's all. That's all me and my personality. So, and getting over the past. So that's pretty much my take on this chapter. Um, Another thing, I've never been that type to get all riled up in rallies and waste. I feel like that's a waste of time. If I'm gonna do something, I'm do something productive towards my life. Like, I just feel like that's just a lot of wasted energy and time. And I mean, what are you gonna accomplish from that? Once okay, you go out there, express yourself, back and forth, and then what? I mean, what if they do pass the law? What people still gonna do what they're gonna want to do? It's just, laws are like guidelines, so they're not like actually set in concrete that people make it to believe. So everything can be broken or bent. So, outro. Subscribe to the channel. Comment any questions you have. Like if the information was inspiring for you, and share this knowledge with other alchemists. Also, follow me on Instagram for more progressive knowledge. My Instagram is Max_Bugatti_8008. I'm all about family first. I'm a global stock investor. I'm a filmmaker. I'm an aerospace botanist. Pretty much what that is. For medical marijuana. I do recreational. I use cannabis for creativity. So that's what aerospace botanist. And pretty much during the summer, I'm gonna grow OG Kush, because that's pretty much my daytime medication, and then Grape Ape is my nighttime medication. And also, I have a masculine confidence building program. Currently, I'm out here in Cali, Colombia, until the 4th of February. While you're slaying dragons, I'll be taming them.